Hey there and welcome back. This is Felix from Goldamer Vintage Watches. In today's video, we let 3 title contenders step into the watch's UFC Octagon ring. In the blue corner, the battery-driven, massive Rolex Oyster Quartz, aka Blue Machine. In the white corner, the experienced Omega Constellation, aka Datejust Killer, with an automatic movement and over 50 years of fighting experience. And in the yellow corner, a hand-wound, powerful Patek Philippe Calatrava, aka Bauhaus Beast, within 46-hour power reserve. But who of these 3 will win the bloody battle for the sought-after belt of the best movement? We highlight the history, pros and cons and characteristics of each competitor and crown the winner at the end of the video. So let's start with the oldest way to make a wristwatch run, the manual winding. In watches with manual winding, a spring is tensioned by turning the crown. And when it relaxes, it sets the watch mechanism in motion. When the spring is completely relaxed, the watch stops and you have to wind it again. While winding keys were once used to wind watches, today this is usually done on pocket watches and wristwatches by turning a crown, which was invented in 1820, perfected by Breguet in 1832, and finally patented by Louis Audemars, the founder of AP, in 1838. But why actually crown? As it turns out, the term is royally inspired, as the round fluted shape of the winding knob reminded many of the crowns of European kings. And the name, crown, stuck. This neo-vintage Calatrava from 1995 has a hand-wound movement. Now, one might wonder why, with all the technical advances in the 20th century watchmaking, high-end brands like Patek Philippe still make hand-wound movements at all. Well, for some it's an antique and rudimentary like the arms of T-Rex. For others, it's timeless simplicity. There is a large percentage of collectors who prefer watches with manual winding. And there are a few reasons for this. First of all, of course, tastes are individual. Furthermore, in addition to taste, there are also facts regarding the advantages. It's just possible to design thinner watches, since the rotor of an automatic movement is not needed. For this reason, they are often found on the wrist on festive occasions. And at the same time, you also have a much better view of the movement, especially when it comes to watches with a crystal case back. Winding a watch has a certain romanticism for many watch lovers and has become a ritual that is performed before the final donning of the watch. Yes, you can say a moment of reflection. On the one hand, this breathes new life into the watch, and on the other, it reminds us of its true function, to show us that time is always moving forward. Furthermore, hand-wound watches are the oldest form of watchmaking and are considered more authentic and historic than automatic or quartz watches. Many people just enjoy the care and attention they require and find winding their timepiece daily a pleasure rather than a chore. So let's briefly get to the heart of all the pros. You see, more of the movement. They are thinner and easier to wear on the wrist, they have a rich history, and they are enormously robust and can last a lifetime. Cons, as the famous poet 50 Cent already said, hate it or love it. The everyday winding of the crown is not for every watch nerd a pleasure. Furthermore, the frequent winding of the crown can lead to premature closure. Additionally, hand-wound watches are known broadly for their beauty and history, but not necessarily for their accuracy. Now let's move on to the next achievement of the 20th century, the automatic movement. In automatic watches, there is a counterweight in the movement, the rotor, as seen here on this Omega Constellation from 1967, which rotates with the movements of the wearer to automatically wind the mainspring. When the mainspring is fully wound, the watch will run for about 24 to 70 hours, depending on the movement, without needing to be rewound. As long as the watch is worn regularly, the watch will continue to run. The invention of the first mass-produced automatic movement dates back to 1923, when the English watchmaker John Harwood patented his first bumper movement without a winding crown. A watch first produced in 1926 and in collaboration with Blancpain in 1928. Bumper simply means that the oscillation weight, or the rotor, in the movement strikes at 270 degrees and is limited by the spring buffers, which also manifests itself as a noise, as a bump, when moving the watch. Unfortunately, this first attempt brought only a moderate power reserve of 8 hours. A little later, in 1931, Rolex presented its idea of an automatic movement with a perpetual movement like you can see it on this Datejust from the 1970s. The first was a 36 oscillating weight without bump and already more than 30 hours power reserve. In this graph you can see the distribution of watch movements from 1942 to 2000. Yellow for manual, green for automatic and quartz movements in gray. You will notice that nobody was really interested from the 1940s until the mid-1950s in this new technology, and people still preferred hand-wound movements. Only about 8% of watches were automatic around 1940. However, the accuracy and reliability of the perpetual rotor was compromised by friction between the components. And now a player comes into the game which is probably not on anyone's mind. And this is Eterna. Eterna found a solution in 1948 with the introduction of a ball bearing rotor that proved ideal. 5 miniature ball bearings, each only 0.65 mm in diameter, provided the necessary support and balance for the rotor, significantly reducing bearing friction and allowing the watch to run smoothly and reliable even under extreme conditions, such as when the watch fell to the ground. This Eterna technology took watchmaking to a new level and soon became the new standard for all automatic wristwatches in the world. And it is still in use today. But even this system was a novelty in its baby shoes. This was partly due to the strict patent that Rolex held on the full rotor movement from 1931 to 1951. All automatic watches at that time had the Rolex perpetual movement or were bumper movements. However, this was to change quickly, and about 15 years later, after the patent expired, there were already as many automatic watches as watches with manual winding on the market. And as you can see from this green line, the triumph of the automatic watches really started in the middle of the 50s. Enough babbling. What are the benefits and disadvantages here? The first one is easy to apply. Put it on, move your wrist, start it. And the whole thing without having to lift a finger. Unromantic, but practicable. It's not difficult to understand that a large part of the watch community prefers automatic watches, and for this reason, today's watch market offers a much larger selection of automatic watches than watches with manual winding. Like hand-wound watches, automatic watches are made with a high level of detail and craftsmanship. So it's no wonder that they can last a lifetime, but of course only if they are properly cared for. On the other side of the coin, most automatic watches are significantly thicker and heavier than their hand-wound brothers. For some people, this may be a disadvantage, for others not, but it's still worth mentioning. And those who get a boner when looking at the complicated and outstandingly crafted movements might have a problem with the rotor obscuring almost 50% of the movement. Automatic watches, while for the most part more accurate than hand-wound watches, are still not as accurate as quartz watches. Speaking of quartz, welcome to the third fighter, the Rolex Oyster Quartz, in today's battle for the best watch movement. As far as quartz watches are concerned, opinions couldn't be further apart. Again, 50 Cent hits the spot. Some love it, others hate it. There are very few people in the middle. The movement of a quartz watch is powered by a battery that sends an electrical signal through a small quartz crystal embedded in the movement. When electricity flows through a quartz crystal, it vibrates or oscillates at nearly perfect constant frequency of 32,768 times per second. And that's pretty damn fast. The constancy of these oscillations is the basis for the movement mechanism, making it very accurate. Although Rolex has never made an official accuracy statement for the Oyster Quartz, it has been said that the movement should not deviate more than 1 minute per year. For comparison, a perfect serviced vintage automatic Datejust, for example, can be quickly around 60 minutes per year. Here too, we would like to take a brief detour into history. Until well into the 1960s, the Swiss watch industry perfected its already mentioned mechanical movement times. The robustness and accuracy of the movements were constantly increased, and no one looked left or right. And also, no one noticed how new technologies were developing either. After all, manufacturers such as Seiko had already been working intensively for several years on new movements that were powered by a quartz battery-operated movement. So it came that in 1969, Seiko introduced the Quartz Astron 35 SQ, the first quartz wristwatch in history. The retail price of the original Seiko Quartz Astron was 450,000 yen, which is equivalent to 3,000 US dollars today. And that was a lot of money for those days. The initially extreme expensive technology became mass market from the early 70s, and the new possibilities of quartz watches were really hyped. They were more accurate and much cheaper than mechanical watches. Cheaper to manufacture and of course cheaper to sell. And brands like Citizen, Seiko and Casio had great success. Over the years, the classic mechanical watches were considered old, out of fashion and hardly demanded by buyers. And this was the beginning of a crisis for the classic watch industry, which threatened its existence. Many well-known companies, especially in Switzerland, went bankrupt, and around 60% of the workforce lost their jobs. Of the original 19,000 jobs in Switzerland, only 30,000 remained within a few years. The Quartz crisis was born. At the beginning of my enthusiasm for watches, I had the opinion that a Quartz watch would be like drinking a non-alcoholic beer. Tastes right, but is somehow wrong. In the meantime, I had held so many fantastic Quartz watches in my hand, like this fantastic IWC Ingenieur SL, the Oyster Quartz, or even the Reverso, for example, that my opinion has changed completely. And non-alcoholic beer tastes me meanwhile also. So Quartz does not automatically mean cheap. Rolex designed and built these 11 jewel movements like mechanical movements with bridges, plates and lever escapements. What's special here is that Rolex largely relied on its in-house construction kit and adopted the mechanism of a previous automatic movement. But enough about the Oyster Quartz. How does the Quartz movement deform? Let's pick apart the pros and cons here as well. Because a Quartz movement contains fewer mechanical parts, the watch also requires little maintenance. If it stops, the battery should be replaced. However, there are also automatic watches that contain a rechargeable battery. These hybrids combine the features of a quartz and an automatic watches. They are called auto quartz or kinetic watches. Most of the time, quartz watches are easier to manufacture, which means they are less expensive. And as we mentioned earlier, quartz watches are the most accurate type of movement in the market. They are extremely accurate because they use the oscillation of the quartz to keep time. Quartz movements take up less space than automatic or mechanical movements, which means that the watches themselves can be slimmer. The disadvantages of these systems are the lack of romance and watchmaking art, the negative history, and they are still considered cheap and less valuable, which is not always the case. Every 2 to 3 years the battery must be replaced and the hands do not run as smoothly and you hear the typical tick-tock noise. Now we know the most important things about all three movement types. But which candidate has now choked the other two down to the ring floor? Automatic, hand-wound or quartz? On this question, the watch world is divided for a long time. As so often in life, the answer is, it depends. Unfortunately, we can't make this decision for you, as much as we would like to. Ultimately, it depends entirely on what you value and what you plan to do with your wristwatch. As we've seen, each type of movement has its advantages and disadvantages. Some are readily available but not as valuable, while others are rarer but not as accurate. So which one is the right for you? So the following 8 questions will make this decision much easier for you. How important is the craftsmanship of the watch to you? Does setting the time and winding it bother you? How often will you wear the watch? Does your watch need to be particularly accurate? What is your budget? How long do you plan to keep your watch? Are you interested in the history of your watch? What is more important to you? Style, craftsmanship, or both? So as always, we hope you learned something new today and that you remembered that non-alcoholic beer is awesome. So have a nice day and hope to see you in our next video.